Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Shabbat. We're up to Perek Yud Gimel Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnah should be Leilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Before we begin today's Mishnah Rabotai, I just want to advise, as always, we will try to explain the Mishnah using the Art Scroll elucidated notes for clarity. But I want to advise whoever has the opportunity to follow along either in the Art Scroll elucidated or in any other illustrated Mishnah, because again, there's many diagrams to understand this melacha setting two heddles, and whoever can follow in visually, it will help them understand this Mishnah. But this melacha now that we're going to discuss is oseh shte batei nirin, setting two heddles, which we spoke about earlier in chapter 7, Mishnah 2. But just to point out again, when we spoke about earlier in chapter 7, Mishnah 2, we gave the 39 melachot, and we said melacha number 18 was setting two heddles. But this Mishnah teaches that one can be liable for doing this melacha whether he uses a weaver's loom or not. If one does the melacha of setting two heddles on a weaver's loom, which means by drawing threads through two heddle eyes and through the comb. Now, like we described here, the warp threads are passed through heddle eyes in two harnesses. In some looms, they are also inserted between the teeth of a comb-like frame, which is used to push the newly woven line of cloth into place. The Mishnah teaches that in order to be liable for setting two heddles in such a loom, one must insert two warp threads not only through the heddle eyes but also through the reed. Again, Rabotai, it's almost impossible, very difficult to understand this Mishnah without looking at the diagrams. I suggest again using the Art Scroll elucidated for the diagrams that they bring to understand the Mishnah. But again, we continue in the Mishnah. Bakeros, banafa, bakivara, basal, or if one does the melacha without a loom, as in the process of making a wicker curtain, a fine sieve, a coarse sieve, or a basket, chayav, he is liable. Now, a curtain made from the interlaced fibers of a palm tree is what is called a wicker curtain. Now, a basket, the Mefarshim explain, weavers lay out all the warp strips needed to form the object he wishes to weave. He then locks them in place using two other strips, which are part of the weft. He passes one of these weft strips over the first warp strip, under the second warp strip, over the third, and so on. He then threads the other weft strip in the opposite way, meaning under the first warp strip, over the second, and so on. Each warp strip is therefore enclosed and held in place by two weft strips, and after that's done, he starts the main weaving process in which he threads other weft strips in and out of the protruding warp strips, and out of the looms that are formed by the first two weft strips around each warp strip are the equivalent of heddle eyes in a loom. Now, in any event, like the Mishnah says, chayav, he is liable. Now, the Mishnah mentions the melachot of sewing and tearing. Vatofer shte tfirot. A person is liable for sewing two stitches in a garment, which the Mefarshim explain, one must make at least two passes of the needle, one in and one out, in order to be liable for sewing. Now, this in and out motion actually results in only one stitch, but nevertheless, it's translated as two stitches because there's no real way in English to say sewing a single pass of the needle. We say two stitches. And the Mishnah concludes, "Va'koreh al menat litpor shte tfirot," and for tearing a garment in order to sew two stitches in it, a person would be liable. Now, before repairing a small hole in fabric, one makes the tear wider so that he can repair it neatly without making creases in the cloth. Now, these descriptions of sewing and tearing are identical to their descriptions in the list of 39 melachot, like we said in chapter 7, Mishnah 2. But our Mishnah repeats them only to introduce the next Mishnah, which discusses the melacha of tearing. And that's what we're going to do right now, Mishnah Gimel. HaKoreh b'hamato v'al one who tears a garment in anger or in grief over his dead. V'chol ha'mekalkelin, and anyone who acts destructively, meaning he performs melacha without a constructive purpose. Piturin, they are exempt from liability for desecrating Shabbat, because the Torah prohibits only acts of design, melechet machshevet, which are constructive, and not acts of destruction. Now, just to go back, the Mefarshim explain, the Mishnah is not referring to the death of one of these seven close relatives, which is father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, and spouse, because in that case, one would be obligated to tear his garment, and tearing to fulfill this obligation is called constructive. The Mishnah was talking about anyone that you're not obligated to tear a garment over. Now, although it would not be tearing in order to sew, like the Mishnah previously said, it would be deemed constructive because it repairs the garment, making it permissible to be worn by the mourner. Because again, if a person is mourning over one of these 7 close relatives, he wouldn't be allowed to wear his garment until he, so to speak, repairs it by tearing it. That's why he would be liable. Now, the Mishnah continued and said, anyone who acts destructively is exempt. Now, for example, a person demolishes a structure without intent to build in its place, or he erases letters without intent to write in their place, like we said again in chapter 7, Mishnah 2, and we explained it. Now, this concept of the Torah prohibiting only acts of design which are constructive and not of destruction, that's from Masechet Chagigah, chapter 10a to 10b. Now, the laws of Shabbat are derived from the labors performed in the building of the Mishkan, which the Torah describes as Melechet Machshevet, calculated labor, in Sefer Shemot, chapter 35, pasuk 33. Therefore, only work that is purposeful and constructive is biblically forbidden. This excludes destructive acts, mikankel, which have no positive purpose. Destructive acts are therefore permitted biblically under biblical law, but they are forbidden by rabbinic decree. Now the Mefarshim point out, one who destroys something for a constructive purpose, like he tears fabric in order to make it easy to repair, that he is liable for doing. And the Mishnah states a rule about melacha of this type. In the case of one who destroys for a constructive purpose, shirokim taken, its minimum amount is the same as the minimum amount for making the repair. Meaning, in order to be liable for a destructive act, the amount destroyed must be large enough that one who repairs it on Shabbat would be liable for the repair. So for example, if one tears a garment so that it can be sewn up more easily, he is liable only if he tears enough fabric in which 2 stitches can be sewn, because 2 stitches is the minimum for the intended repair of sewing, like we previously said. Likewise, one who erases letters so that others can be written in their place, he is liable only if he erases at least 2 letters, that being the minimum measurement for the melacha of writing, like we said in chapter 12, Mishnah 3. However, one who demolishes with intent to rebuild is liable for destroying even the slightest amount, because there is no minimum for the melacha of building, like we said in chapter 12, Mishnah 1. And if you remember, we said over there the reason was because building even the smallest amount can be significant, such as filling a small hole that spoils the beauty of a mansion. Therefore, a person would be liable for any amount of building, and that's why regarding demolishing with intent to rebuild, you'd be liable for destroying even the slightest amount, because again, there's no minimum for the melacha of building. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen v'Amen.